Very simple indications are that preparations clearly are underway here. The streets are being beautified, as they say. Some events have been called off here in Islamabad, and there has just been a lot of speculation over the last week whether a second round of talks might be possible. Certainly the authorities here, and that includes the political authorities, are very much preparing for a second round of talks. The speculation, of course, is when exactly this might happen, when delegations might arrive. We have no confirmation whatsoever on that. Now, as you can see, appears to be a serious problem with the Strait of Hormuz being blocked again by Iran. That gives you an indication that on the ground, things can't be going toward a second round of negotiations. But at the same time, these are two sides that can get together and negotiate. The two things can be possible. There can be fresh hostilities, for example. There can be further tensions between the US and Iran, for example, in the Strait of Hormuz. And at the same time, the two negotiating teams are getting ready to travel here to the Pakistani capital of Islamabad for a second round of talks. It did look like everything was falling into place rather perfectly yesterday with the announcement from both the Iranian foreign minister and President Trump that the Strait of Hormuz would be fully reopened again. There was the 10-day ceasefire that was holding between Israel and Hezbollah. The simple fact that the ceasefire right now between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other also is, for the moment, is holding and could very well be extended further still. But then you have further doubts creep in. But at the end of the day, the reality here on the ground is certainly the government here, the authorities are excited about potentially hosting a second round of talks. The people here as well, and preparations certainly are underway.
Let's go to Jeff Mason. Jeff, are you excited about a potential round of talks? And who do you think you heard Philip talk about Pakistan is getting ready? Who from the White House team is getting ready? Are we expecting the same players from last time to go? And at this point, what are the odds of these talks actually happening?
Well, a lot to unpack there. And number one, what are the odds? The odds seem high because that's the messaging that the White House has been giving. It's the messaging that President Trump has been giving, that he is ready to end this war and he's ready for an extension of peace and not just an extension, but something more permanent. That said, I think with the news this morning about the Strait of Hormuz and also the clips that you played from what President Trump said on Air Force One last night, it's important to underscore again the mixed messages that the president and the White House have been sending about this since day one of the war. And that is exemplified in the fact that many of the things that the president said have been agreed or are done simply are not, or have not at least been confirmed by Iran. And they being Tehran in this case, are showing that or manifesting that in the Strait of Hormuz. Again, after yesterday, really goosing markets and exciting the rest of the world by saying that the Strait of Hormuz was open. Now it's not. Again, we'll see if President Trump comments on that today in the Oval Office. I think it casts, in general, to your question, Christina, a broad cloud of doubt over when and whether these talks will happen again, and whether they're nearly as far along in moving towards peace as the president has suggested.
As we have been from the very beginning of this conflict, we've been looking at two fronts, of course, the front in Iran and the front in Lebanon as well. And the president remarked on Lebanon yesterday at this Turning Point conference in Arizona. He did this swing through the American West and gave a couple of speeches. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about the role that Lebanon has played in this ceasefire negotiation.
Our deal with Iran is not in any way tied to Lebanon, but we will make Lebanon great again. I mean, it's about time we've sort of, the world has forgotten them, and they're good people who have lived like hell for a long period of time. And hopefully the situation with Hezbollah will get straightened out quickly.
Dan Williams, I won't ask you what it means to make Lebanon great again, but I'm curious if you could just talk a bit about the role that Lebanon played here in getting us to the position we were in yesterday when we had the Iranian foreign minister announcing this ceasefire deal on X yesterday morning.
It depends who you believe. You heard the US president say just there that these were unrelated, these deals. It's no secret, however, that the Iranians very much wanted to see an end to Israeli attacks on Hezbollah, on Lebanon. Keep in mind that Hezbollah is Iran's biggest guerrilla ally, biggest proxy. Presumably the Iranians want to see Hezbollah preserved almost as much as they want to see their own regime preserved in Iran. So that was agreed. It was agreed apparently with some high-handedness by the US president, because there's a credible report here that on the night when it was agreed, as the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was assembling a telephone vote by his security cabinet ministers, the news reported that Trump had already announced that the ceasefire was in place. Israel had agreed and it would begin at midnight. And there was some jostling and joking, I imagine mordant jokes among those ministers as to whether there was any point on them voting if it already had been announced widely, publicly, internationally. Add to that also that Trump, in that flurry of posts on Truth Social just a couple days ago, spoke very high-handedly about having effectively ordered Israel to cease fire in Lebanon. Enough is enough, he said. That optically isn't great for Israel's assertion of sovereignty in this war, of being an equal partner. It may also cost Netanyahu in the ballot box in a few months when Israel holds an election, given that many residents of northern Israel that have spent the last month in shelters, seeing their economy, their social fabric ruined by Hezbollah rockets, feel that they were shortchanged by the ceasefire, even though it's only a 10-day ceasefire, feel essentially that Hezbollah has been left standing and threatening them in the future.
Phil, I want to go back to you now. I'm going to read, there's something crossing the Associated Press right now with Dateline out of Cairo saying the British military is saying just a little while ago 2 gunboats from the IRGC opened fire on a tanker transiting the Strait of Hormuz after Iran said it had reimposed restrictions, as we reported this morning, in the area. The UK is saying the tanker and crew are reported safe. They have not identified the vessel or its destination. I want to ask you, because the last time we talked to you, or one of the many times we talked to you, you were at the Strait. I know you've done a lot of reporting around there. Were any of those 20,000 sailors or merchant marines able to get out in this intervening time where it was unclear if the Strait was operational? And even though we had that brief period of time where Iran said traffic was open, did anyone take the risk? It didn't seem like, we watch these maps all the time, that really anybody was willing to gamble with their personnel or their equipment. And is that going to be the status quo for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, really strange situation, this one, this short moment of freedom, if you will, freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, that some tankers did decide to at least try out. Satellite imagery does show, and the tracking data shows, that quite a lot of those ships, that includes tankers, of course, try to get out of the Persian Gulf, where they have been stuck for a very long time, some 6-7 weeks or more, but then turned around again. Maybe the moment where they noticed that the big announcement of an end of the Strait of Hormuz blockade, both by Iran and the United States, wasn't really what it sounded like, both from the president and from the Iranian foreign minister. We have no confirmation of any ships managing to make it through, but as you mentioned there, that is a first incident in the Strait of Hormuz with actual gunships from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards firing at a tanker. It's the first time we hear of that in a long time. I think it's going to be at least 3 or 4 weeks, because there had been these threats and indeed attacks at the start of the US-Israeli war on Iran. Plenty of attacks on, I believe it was just under a dozen of ships that were attacked by Iranian gunships and other Iranian forces. And those threats remained throughout this war. And it was those threats that led to tankers and, of course, the shipping companies and the insurance companies whose rates were skyrocketing, who decided that it was just not going to be safe enough to attempt a passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Now we are back to exactly that, to an actual attack by the IRGC on a tanker, according to the UK military. Now that is a serious escalation and a return to the situation we were in about 5 weeks ago. Just one attack like this one is going to put the fear in a lot of shipping companies, transport companies, in the sailors themselves, to not attempt another passage through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
Jeff Mason, I'll turn to you lastly, and I'm curious sort of what the White House has been saying about the back and forth that's been happening, not directly between Iranian officials and President Trump. The president has been indicating that Iran is prepared to give a host of concessions, including moving that nuclear dust, as it was put during that gaggle on Air Force One, letting the U.S. come in and, with Iran's cooperation, presumably move it out. No real confirmation of that from the Iranian side. How do they explain that level of disconnect? And do you see that as potentially just sort of laying the parameters for perhaps the second round of negotiations?
Well, there isn't an explanation for that disconnect, and I think that's that's largely the problem. And markets are listening to what President Trump says when he's giving a positive spin or putting a positive spin on the state of play, and that's pleasing everyone because it's clear that President Trump has moved in the direction of wanting to end this war. And I wrote a story about that yesterday. He's got domestic issues that he'd like to focus on. That's manifested in the trip that he made this week, talking more about the economy, talking about politics, talking a little bit less about Iran. But the reality is that the deal that he's talking about has not been hammered out. And a lot of the details that he's wanting to trumpet, including about nuclear dust, clearly have not been agreed to by Iran. So that is a large weakness hanging over, or at least a large question mark hanging over the prospect of peace that the White House has not offered an explanation for.